Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with jazz trombonist Marshall Gilkes. He talked about his latest 2018 CD, Always Forward, with the WDR Big Band, and he got in some quality time with that band during a 4-year stint in Germany. He talked about his father, who was in the Air Force and also played the trombone and jazz, and he talked about a great career in jazz that has led him to big names like Maria Schneider, Christian McBride, and so many others. He reflected, looked forward, and imparted some wisdom. So get to know him and dig this interview, my friends.
Marshall, thank you for taking a minute out for me on Jazz. I appreciate it.
Oh, no, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So let's go ahead and dive right in here. I really dig this new album, Always Forward. There's so much power behind this album. And I have kind of I've been doing this show since 2011, and I've always been a vibes guy, but I've really acquired a more increasing love and taste for the trombone when I see it live. It's one of those brass instruments that has no specific place to stop or start. It's kind of open to latitude, and it's fascinating to me. So I'm always really, I love all the instruments, but the trombone has been really intriguing to me. So, so again, thank you for taking a minute out. I just want to ask you, with Always Forward, I know that you spent a lot of time with the WDR Big Band. 4 years you spent with them in Germany. So I want to know, what was the idea behind this album, and how do you feel about how it turned out?
This album, I guess, in some ways was kind of a follow-up to the album I did that I basically recorded right after I left the band. The previous album was called Köln, which is Cologne, just in German, and that came out, I guess, in 2015. It was pretty successful. The manager, basically, he kind of invited me back to do another project. Yeah, and basically it was kind of, I wrote most of this material kind of specifically for this project. You know, I knew pretty far in advance, like 8 to 10 months that we were going to be doing it. So, and there's a couple tunes on here that are arrangements of old tunes of mine that I always wanted to kind of make a big band version of. A lot of the material is just a new original stuff. There's a piece on the album that I wrote for my son. There's a new arrangement of Easy to Love that I did. It was a tune I always loved practicing. And then there's a suite that the WDR commissioned specifically for this concert called the Denali Suite that's on the record. So, but I guess all in all, I mean, if there's anything, I think most of my records, I don't really think about a theme for things before I go to record them. I kind of more just try to write what I'm into and what I hear at the time, That the title track and that title, Always Forward, for me is just kind of, has to do with all kinds of things. But just kind of a more or less a musical motto and a life motto that, no matter what happens, to keep on pushing forward with, what you do.
So speaking of birth, that being kind of a theme here, you were born on Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland. You hopped from D.C. to New Hampshire, Jersey, Alabama, Illinois, Colorado. You've kind of been all over the place, and everything started, your father was a trombonist and a conductor in the Air Force. Talk to me about your childhood and your rearing kind of into jazz.
Yeah, I grew up all over the place, but I was, surrounded by music, so, because my dad was a conductor, he had originally played euphonium in the Air Force, the ceremonial brass of the Air Force Band in D.C., but he was a trombone major at the Eastern School of Music. Yeah, basically, so we moved, we moved all over the country, but it was all bands, and he became a conductor, and then, so I guess, the last place we ended up was he was stationed at the Air Force Academy, I was around 8th grade then when we moved there, and that's when I first started getting into jazz, and there was a great big band that was part of the unit that he was the commander and conductor of, and that big band was called the Falconaires. And those guys were kind of my introduction into jazz, and then, meeting those guys, studied with a couple of the members of the band, and then they would kind of turn me on to, you should check out J.J. Johnson, or you should check out Michael Brecker, or you should check out this, you know what I mean? And that's, so actually I kind of got into jazz through big bands because that's what I was surrounded by there,
Well, and it did mention, too, in your bio that, you were busy, and Louis Armstrong was a part of this whole thing. So I guess, was there anybody else in that realm? Was it trombonists, big bands that really pulled you, or was it kind of a hodgepodge of all kinds of jazz cats?
So it kind of started with the big band thing because that's what I was around. But my senior year, like I said, also like those guys from the band were kind of turning me on to other things, and I actually kind of I started buying some, I think I remember being in a Walmart and buying like Louis Armstrong and Dizzy records and stuff like that. And then from there, like I said, those guys, one of the trombone players would say, "Oh, check out Carl Fontana, check out this, and this and that." And then my senior year of high school, I got the opportunity to go to Interlochen Arts Academy in Michigan, which is like basically a boarding school, and has a really great jazz program. And so there, all of a sudden I was surrounded with, a bunch of other kids with the same interests, but everybody had come from a different background, I got exposed to a lot more music of different stuff, a lot more variety. So like, I guess a lot more small group stuff. I remember, one of the piano player there, he was really into Herbie Hancock, and then, other guys, and just kind of, by being in the school and surrounded by other kids the same age that are really enthusiastic about music, I kind of, I was kind of introduced to a lot of other stuff. And I remember there, actually also, my director there was a guy named Bill Sears, who was a really great, saxophonist and a great educator. And I remember when I was there, it must have been around January, because it was back when they still had IAJE, the International Association of Jazz Educators Conference. And he came back and he said, "Man, have you ever heard this trombone player Conrad Herwig?" He's like, "You got to check this guy out." And I remember I ordered one of his CDs, and I was just blown away by his playing, And later, I actually went to Wayne Patterson for a year to study with him.
Well, speaking of studying, you go to the Juilliard. You learn from Joseph Alessi, and what was that experience like? What did you learn at Juilliard?
Well, so my path through school was pretty unorthodox. I went to, after that senior year at Interlochen Arts Academy, I went back to Colorado and studied at the University of Northern Colorado. And there was no jazz major there, but there was a big jazz program, so I was a classical major, then played in the big. I left after a year, though, and I went to Wayne Patterson because I kind of knew I wanted to get to the New York area. And then after a year at Wayne Patterson, I decided, I'm not sure about the school thing right now. So I basically quit school at the time, and I moved into the city. I worked a few months as a waiter, and then eventually kind of started a playing career, and then was really, kind of a professional. Working as a professional for quite some years, doing everything from, playing jazz gigs and big bands to playing on Broadway shows. I even did a Broadway tour when I was about 23 for a year. Probably, mid-20s, I decided to go back and finish my degree, and that's when I went to Juilliard. So I finished my bachelor's, and when I was there, I studied with Wycliffe Gordon, finishing my bachelor's there for a couple of years, and then they invited me back to be part of the artist diploma program that they have, and so it's basically just a group, like a quintet that they put together. You just take lessons and then play with the quintet a couple times a week, and that's kind of the whole program. And that's when I studied with Alessi. So basically, we worked on. I always loved working on classical playing, and I've always basically practiced. A lot of my practice has been kind of rooted in the classical, kind of like rudiments and stuff and routine. Anyway, I basically worked with him when I studied with him on just on classical excerpts, really like what you would do to prepare for an orchestra audition. I love working on that stuff, and I think that makes me a better player, better musician, better jazz player,
Well, you get settled in the New York area back in around 98, and then you start playing with David Berger, Wynton Marsalis, Darcy James, The Secret Society, Christian McBride. You're hitting the ground running right there. What did you learn at that point in your life about being around big shots?
I wouldn't say that like when I first moved to New York, I wasn't playing with all those guys right off the bat. And I guess of the people you mentioned, the first person I played with was David Berger. It's weird. I would say it probably was a couple of years before I was like kind of. I remember actually in David Berger's band, like maybe the first rehearsal I ever did with them was at the Musicians Union. And I walked in and I sat down, and then I looked over, and Dennis Irwin was playing bass, and that was one of the first people I was kind of, I was kind of jazz shell shocked by, because I was like, oh man, that's the guy from John Scofield's Hand Jive record, and I was really kind of blown away. And then I would say it was kind of actually some years. I guess I played a lot with Darcy back then, but also as part of a group before he had Secret Society. I played with him with it was part of a kind of a music collective called Pulse, and I think it was 3 composers, and we would rehearse sometimes at the evening. And then with his I may have played his first Secret Society gig, and then I've played with him a few times since then, but I was never really like a full-time member of his band, but kind of played when he was first in town with him. And occasionally now I'll play with him. I played at Newport Jazz a couple of years ago with him. And then Christian McBride actually was somebody I met when I was in Germany, so when I was at WDR. And then when I moved back, then that's when he called me a few times to play with his band. I would say, like when I first moved to New York, it wasn't. I wouldn't say I just hit the road running. I worked as a waiter for a while, and I think also for a lot of years I did everything I could get my hands on. I tell this to a lot of students where I teach now that you just get in the mindset of saying yes, yes, yes to everything, because you never know where it's going to lead, and it's just funny, I always tell them I can kind of trace, like I play with Maria Schneider Orchestra now, and I can kind of trace how I found my way there back to maybe the first rehearsal I ever did in Brooklyn, which was like with a kind of a neighborhood salsa band that a friend called me to play. And then I met one trombone player, and then he recommended me for something else, and it's kind of just a chain effect like anything. So, and I think the longer you stick with it and the longer that happens, the more chance that you're eventually going to get to play with some of the big name people that you just mentioned.
But let me ask you about Maria. Maria is one of the most respected band leaders out there in the world of jazz, and that had to be an incredible experience to be with her.
Basically, I first heard her music when I was a freshman in college. There was a friend of mine at the school there, and he was a pianist, and he said, "Oh man, you got to check out Maria Schneider." And I remember being at Tower Records in Denver, and I went in and I bought her first record, Evanescence, and then it blew me away. And it was also kind of a record that I think when you're a young jazz player and you're going to jazz schools and stuff and studying, I think sometimes like there's this pressure that you have to be playing the hippest stuff and the most technically difficult stuff. I don't know if you know what I mean, but and kind of like listening to her music, not that it's not incredibly complex, but it also has this very personal aspect to it, which and it's also, I remember listening to like the tune of hers called Greenpeace, and I would listen to that over and over again. It's just this beautiful melody, and I don't know, it's kind of like that music kind of started making me feel like, oh, it's okay to like what I like. I don't have to worry about all this pressure from these other jazz people make me feel like I have to play something that's so complex or hard. I don't know if you know what I mean. So anyway, so then I was into that, and then other records, and then even years later, I remember listening to Choro Danzato, is a piece of hers that features Rich Berry, and I just love that composition. I used to listen to it all the time. And then she came to see me. A couple things happened. Number one, she came down to a club that was called Sweet Rhythm at the time. It was previously Sweet Basil's. But for a while, I used to play there every Sunday with this trio I was a part of for a long time, with Edmar Castañeda. He's a harpist from Colombia. And she came down to see us once, and that's where I met her. And then I guess ultimately what happened is I also, kind of going back to what I said before about that kind of chain effect thing, you never know who you're going to meet. With David Berger one time, usually his band was kind of like an Ellington setup, so just 3 trombones. But there was one recording session we did where we recorded this piece that he had written years ago that used bass trombone as well, and he hired George Flynn, who's Maria's bass trombonist, and that's where I met George. And so then I think ultimately he also recommended me, and she had heard me play, and that's kind of how I ended up in her band. But yeah, it's kind of crazy now, then getting to play, like on the last record, there's a piece she wrote for Greg Gisbert and I, for me and Greg Gisbert, and it's just kind of, I think now, like back to being at Tower Records and buying that, listening to my dorm room, and now, to be playing something that she wrote for me, it's pretty cool.
Absolutely, that's dream realized right there. So 2004 is the year that you released your first album, and we're being reflective and looking back on things. How do you feel about your evolution as a musician since that first album came out?
Yeah, I guess so. It's funny. If you told me back then that I was going to release 2 big band records, I never would have believed that. At the time, that wasn't really something I was thinking about, writing big band charts, or to be honest, back then, like writing a big band chart seemed like a pretty daunting task to even think about, So, no, I guess I'm pretty happy. I think I've gotten a lot of musical experiences over the years that have helped shape who I am now, musically. If I look compositionally, I could say like each record, there's almost more of a more of a through composed element, I think, that goes into play. So it's funny, on this record, actually, that there's a tune that's on my very first record called Puddle Jumping, which on the first record I just kind of play the riff, and then it goes into a blues, basically. And I kind of, sometimes traveling around when I go, a lot of people want to hear that tune, but if I'm playing with a big band, I kind of got to the point where I thought, I want to write a version of this, but as if I wrote the tune today. So it's almost kind of more of like a themes and variations on the tune, but it's like more of a through composed thing, and almost kind of a concerto for myself that I wrote, if you know what I mean. I feel like I'm a much more refined, trombone player today. I feel like as a composer too, there's a lot, I feel like I've just from the musicians I've played with over the years, and then, people I've studied with, and then just, I think just maybe getting older and figuring out what I like better. And yeah, I feel like, it's interesting. Like when I first moved to New York, I never knew I was gonna end up playing some in the Latin music world, and that's, I think, affected my, influenced my writing a lot over the years. Yeah, I think also definitely playing with people like Maria Schneider or David Berger. There's one chart on this record where I definitely feel some influence from having played with him quite a bit. I never would have been able to predict what I've gotten into, back then. It's a pretty, I'm saying, pretty different person,
The theme here is kind of evolution, and this next question is kind of a part of that. It had to be a huge learning experience for you, not only as a musician, but as a human being, to go to Europe and to spend 4 years there, especially with a big band. Like you said, you're surprised that things have turned out the way they have over the years with a big band. Was that a pretty seminal period in your life?
When that opportunity came, the year prior, I had been touring with Richard Bona's band, the bass player. We had been on about a 8-week straight tour that fall, and I don't know. It's interesting. I always kind of, when I went over there, when I accepted the position. I mean, number one, it's a really great band, and I knew the group from originally through a record that my brother had, which is called East Coast Blowout. It's Jim McNeely did all the writing, and his pictures John Schofield and Mark Johnson and Adam Nussbaum, and then WDR Big Band. That was like the first thing I ever heard from them. So I knew of the band, and then the position was open. And what had happened is John Fedchuk, who's also a great trombonist and great big band writer, he sent me an email saying, "Hey man, I think these guys are looking for somebody. Check it out or whatever." And I wrote them and ultimately submitted some materials. And then the way they did auditions was really cool. They had me, the first time I went over, I guess it would have been fall of 2008, I think, November 2008, and I went over and played. Basically, they hire you to work with the band for a couple of weeks, and then they did that with people for about a year, and then they invited me back again. And I worked then about 3.5 weeks with the band, and then a few months later they offered me the position. And I remember a lot of people in New York kind of like, man, why would you do that? Why would you leave New York? And it's funny I think everybody always has this kind of, well, at least a lot of people I know in New York, everybody thinks like, oh, only New York, this is the only place to be or whatever. And, to be quite frank, living in New York is tough, and it gets tougher and tougher just because it gets more and more expensive. And I just started feeling like, man, I was constantly traveling, or constantly doing this and that, and I don't know if I ever really had that mentality that other people have about the city of New York. I love it, and ultimately I came back to it. But there's great musicians everywhere, and the way I kind of saw the thing there, I was mostly traveling, to make a living anyway. So. I didn't really stop playing with most of the groups that I play with when I went to Germany. So in a lot of ways, musically, in terms of, nothing really changed except that I had this, was playing full time with that group. But it's not 12 months a year. It's more like eight months out of the year that you're really working there. And so, I got up and moved to Germany. It was an interesting experience. It's different, It was. I think of a lot of European countries. That actually Germany. When I moved there, it's actually maybe I spent a lot of time in Europe, but maybe not that much time in Germany itself. It was a really great experience and interesting. And not just musically, but I think when you spend time in a country like that, Germany is a pretty amazing place, and an amazing country, and I think it puts a lot of perspective. I almost wish every American could spend some time overseas or in a Northern European or a European country just to kind of see how things work in terms of society and social programs and everything. And I don't know, it's interesting. There's kind of a certain peace of mind that you have when you're living there that I oftentimes don't feel the same thing living back here in the States, you know.
I agree. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, we're talking about learning experiences and ways that you grow as a musician. One of those has to be seeing live jazz. What live jazz shows, a live jazz show or a few have you seen that really left a deep impact on you?
Well, I've seen Brad Meldau's trio a few times live, and that's always been pretty incredible. A show that I saw multiple times because when I went to Wayne Patterson when I first moved to the city, Kurt Rosenwinkel, he used to play every Tuesday at Smalls, the old Smalls, not it's in the same place now, but it was before they renovated it. So Smalls, it's still there. It's a great club now, but back then it was just kind of like a shell of an old bar, but they didn't really do anything. There was a stage, and you could if you could carry in a 6-pack and a pizza, and sit there. You paid $10 and you could stay till like 5 in the morning. But anyway, Kurt Rosenwinkel used to play there every Tuesday night, and the regular band was with Jeff Ballard and Ben Street and Kurt Rosenwinkel, obviously because of his band, and Mark Turner, Jeff Ballard, Ben Street, Kurt Rosenwinkel, yeah. And I used to go with friends. We would go in almost every Tuesday. And I remember the first time I went, a friend of mine from Wayne passed, we got to go see this group, and I had no idea who that was. But, man, I was blown away. And I still, I just sit on you had this old velvet sofa sort of on the side. You could sit there, and I would sit there and listen. And it was just, incredible. I loved his compositions and just it was so fresh to me that what they were doing, So over the years, there's so much, but that was one, going back, and I mean, his compositions, they were like, they felt like hits to me, It was like,
sure.
Like, oh man, I love this one, they're playing this, it was like and that was before any recording had ever even come out of him, or maybe something had come out like Trio on Fresh Sound label there was a trio record he did with Avishai Cohen and I think Jorge Rossi or something like that. But yeah, I used to just love going to see that. I mean, I'm sure there's tons of concerts. It's kind of hard for me to think about, right? There's one concert I saw, and then it led to me buying a record that I've listened to. I mean, probably I shouldn't say more than any other record, but maybe more than any other contemporary record in the last few years. Even my wife loves it. Like my brother was here recently, and my brother's like, "Man, is your wife listen to this record?" He was just surprised because my wife's not a musician, but it was actually I remember being in Israel, Israel, and seeing Avishai Cohen's trio with Mark Juliana and Shai Maestro. So this is a while back now, probably 10 years ago, but it was just unbelievable, and the stuff they were doing was. Yeah, I mean, I went out right away and bought the record. I was blown away. But,
no, that's good. I kind of wanted to snapshot, but that visual of Smalls is perfect. In fact, I got to tell you, New York's on my list, and I interviewed Gerald Cannon probably about a year ago, and he told me a story about the first time he ever went there. I can't remember where he was at, but he went down into the cellar and saw George Coleman. He was so freaked out that he was in New York and saw a show live that he came up, stood on the sidewalk, and fainted. Like, literally fell to the earth, like boom, thud. And I keep thinking when I finally do make it to the Mecca and I do see that show, I'm going to probably have the same feeling where it's just going to be so much like the Village or something like that. I love seeing live music, and I just haven't been to New York, but it has to be quite an experience to be up there to see that kind of caliber of music live.
It's amazing. There's always something going on. You can always go see something,
Yeah, without a doubt.
Even when I live upstate, a couple of years ago I moved up north of the city, so I still take like the commuter rail and the Metro North, but I live, over an hour north of the city now in a town called Beacon. But there's a little club in Beacon where actually people come to play from the city all the time, and there's another place across the river called the Falcon that I used to come up there every now and then to play when I still lived in the city, So it's amazing. Even this far north, there's still this, the outreach is still here, by musicians coming up to play and whatnot.
So are you in Long Island?
No, I'm north. So I'm up the Hudson, like right on the Hudson River. So they call it Hudson Valley where I live.
I got
in
you.
New York.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's hard for me. My dad actually was born in Brooklyn, and he was raised in Long Island. He was in Massapequa. So
That's where my dad's from, Massapequa Park. Yeah.
Wow, interesting. Yeah, my
dad was born and raised there. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
Well, we both have dads from Massapequa that joined the Air Force. Interesting.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. I got a few more questions, and I want to
Sure.
know why do you love jazz?
I guess one of the biggest reasons is it's you can still you put your stamp on it. Like you can. I think it's a genre that you can really come up with your own unique voice and unique style of playing, and it's a way to kind of channel and funnel everything that goes on into your life into your improvisation, your playing, your compositions, and I think it's also something where there's endless possibilities, so I guess I like I guess the freedom of it, like that, the freedom to be able to express, who you are and what's going on in your life,
Absolutely. I want to understand so we can understand a little bit more about you. Everyone has a perception or a version of who they think you are. Your family, your friends, your fans, but you know who you are. You run your life. So who do you think you are?
Who do I think wow. That's a tough question, man. I'm somebody who loves music and loves playing trombone, but I also love a lot of other things, I'm passionate about a lot of, about family and passionate about, I think I'm pretty passionate about how we're developing as a country and as a society. And what? Yeah, who am I? That's a tough question, man. You put me on the spot. I'm somebody I love joking around. I love having people over to my house and cooking, hanging. I love spending time with people, and sharing stories and but I also, I love to practice. I love to sit down the piano and just kind of explore and try to find new things or, new tunes, new melodies. But I also, I love a lot of different things. I love skiing. I'm really into skiing. Actually, the cover of this new record, most people don't know because my friend who did the design, he messed around with it a little bit. It's kind of hard to tell, but that picture on the cover I actually took while I was hiking with my skis on Wolf Creek Pass in Colorado.
A great picture.
Yeah, and so anyway, but actually the funny story is that I guess must have been earlier this year, maybe in March. Maria Schneider actually had a tour in Colorado, or two dates in Colorado, and then one date in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I was like, oh man, finally I can live my dream, which was like to be able to ski during the day and then play gigs at night, And so actually that night after skiing, that was hiking up at about 12,500 feet, and then I left about 2 p.m. and then drove the rest of the way to Durango, and then we had a gig that night in Durango, Colorado with Maria. So yeah, and I love a lot of things. I feel like I don't even have time to do all the things that I'm interested in life, sort of, it's tough, it's hard enough to try to play trombone and compose and write for a big band, it's hard enough to keep up with, but lately I really like doing, do-it-yourself projects at home, so I've just been doing all these renovations around my house, and I don't know if that answers your question, I don't know.
That does.
Probably looking for a deeper answer than that, but I don't
No, No, and it's interesting because it's the hardest, deepest last question I usually put out there, and it really kind of embodies who people are and who you are and how you do it. You hit it, yeah. So, people always say, man, you got to slow down, and I always tell people my dad's from New York and this, that, and the other, but at the end of the day, man, we don't have a lot of time. I got to get it on. I got things I want to do.
Oh, yeah. It's funny. My dad used to always tell me, he's like, when speaking wise, you got to slow down.
Right.
Yeah.
Like you said, man, there's so much to do in this life, and I think the older you get, especially when you have kids that age, you realize, man, alive, I'm halfway done, or I'm, over halfway done, and it's.
Yeah, I remember when my son was first born, I thought, because when you're an infant, you actually have a lot of free time. When you're sleeping, I remember telling somebody like, I said, actually, man, I think I might actually get more practicing done now because I feel like, I was totally wrong. Yeah. Of course, as soon as he starts, running around, it's like, no.
It's over with.
So,
Without a doubt. Well, hey, Marshall, thank you for taking some time out. Good luck on the next journey in your life with the baby. I hope everything's wonderful with that, and keep on making the great music, man. I love it.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, thanks for having me on the show.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to yet another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in Colorado, New York, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Marshall for his class, his music, and his time. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store. Visit neonjazz at youtube.com. And for everything Neon Jazz, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.